it took more than 10 years for Robert Sapolsky to write Behave. He was last on our show 10 years ago, so we know what he was doing. And before we bring him on, we had Julia Sweeney at Freethought Hall last week, gave her a quick tour.
The actress and comedian.
The actress. And when we told her that we were going to be interviewing you, Robert, on our show this week, she said, "He's my hero." So welcome to Freethought Radio.
Thanks for having me on.
So you really have been busy for the last 10 years. We spoke to you in February of 2007. So working on this book must have been it's a grand tour. It must have been a huge project.
Well, it was, this is going to make it seem even worse, but frankly, I've been thinking about writing this one since I was an undergraduate. So just showing how, delusional one can be in some ways, of just trying to make sense of the biology of human behavior and social behavior, and most importantly, behaviors that we judge as good or bad or in between.
So I think from reading almost everything you've written, you might have, and I don't know if you agree with me, a unique perspective here. You say you make your living as a combination neurobiologist who studies the brain and a primatologist who studies monkeys and apes. So do you think those two fields kind of give you a perspective that maybe others don't have?
I suspect so. What I've essentially been doing my whole career since after college is oscillating back and forth between being in the lab studying neurons and dishes and mucking with genes and neurons and fairly reductive sort of approaches to understanding the brain and behavior. And then every summer for more than 30 years, skipping out and studying a population of wild baboons in a national park in East Africa and looking at their behavior and physiology. So I think, yeah, absolutely, what one does by definition there is try to make sense of some of the same questions about behavior from more than one discipline.
So unlike, you use the word behavior, unlike behaviorism, which kind of studies organisms in a weird kind of sterile, unnatural environment, you actually go out and you look at animals and living organisms right where they are, which I think is called ethology, right? You're looking at how they actually behave where they live. Yeah,
and it's nice that you bring up the term ethology. Sort of one of the sound bites of that field is ethology is the process of interviewing an animal, parentheses, about its behaviors, but in its own language. In other words, you really can't make a whole lot of sense about the behavior of some animal in a lab cage, or you'll be missing an awful lot. So, yeah, looking at things out in the natural setting where I think you have more insights into ecological influences on behavior, obviously evolutionary stuff. And that kind of speaks to the larger theme of the book, which is if you want to make sense of a human behavior, again, good, bad, or ambiguously in between, you have a prayer, so to speak, of understanding what's really going on if you decide it's all going to be explained by this one brain process, or this one hormone, or here's the gene, or here's the childhood experience, or here's the evolutionary selective pressure that explains it all. And instead, not only do you have to look at behavior from all those different disciplinary angles, but they're ultimately all the same. And if you're talking about how the brain functioned in somebody just now, you're also talking about how hormones are affecting that function since this morning. And you're also talking about how that brain was constructed during fetal life and what fetal environment had to do with it. And you're also, of course, talking about the genes that code for some of those brain proteins. And the second you're talking about genes, you're also implicitly talking about the evolution of those genes. So not only is it essential to bring in, a multidisciplinary approach, but it's all ultimately sort of there's no boundaries. All the influences there are highly interconnected.
Well, so just to interject, this maybe what a fundamentalist a Christian might think about original sin influencing the brain. What would your response be?
That makes no more sense to me than trying to figure out sort of what neurotransmitters are most central to understanding the behavior of the Easter Bunny or the Teletubbies. I mean, it doesn't
Not
at
helpful.
all. No.
So the book explores the biology of things like violence, aggression, competition versus cooperation, empathy, altruism. You want to talk a little bit more about that?
A theme over and over in there is how context-dependent these behaviors are. I mean, if you want to understand behavior, the biology of it, it is like mindlessly simple to just understand the motoric aspects of the behavior. Like your brain tells your spine, tells your muscles to do something, and hooray, you've behaved. You've moved your arms. You've articulated your tongue to speak something, whatever. That's like totally simple biology. What's insanely hard is the fact that that exact same motoric behavior can mean such different things in different circumstances. And depending on those circumstances, you pull a trigger of a gun, and that could be one of the most damaging things imaginable, or that could be a suicidally heroic act on your part. You put your hand on someone else's, and in one setting that's deeply compassionate, in another that's a deep betrayal. In other words...
Or sexual harassment even, yeah.
Exactly. What's most interesting about human behavior is how the meaning of it differs so much in different contexts. And that is a lot harder to understand the biology of that.
But what I think your book, your basic premise of the book is that whatever the answers are, and you end the book by saying it's really complicated, but whatever the answers are, they're going to be biological answers. And of course, it just doesn't ignore psychology or behavior or any of those things, but we're looking at the fact that we are basically animals.
We're animals, and we're animals who function with organs and cells and molecules that obey the laws of the physical universe, and nothing happens without some sort of preceding causal mechanism. And there's nothing that could be explained in behavior that has to invoke some sort of magical little homunculus sitting in our brains there that's sort of in our brains, but not of it, and made of some sort of magical material that isn't obeying the laws of the physical universe. All that's happening is we're just learning vastly more about what those biological influences are in our behaviors.
And like you say, it's not just a simple linear chain of cause and effect. It's this huge interconnected array of causes and reasons. Looking at the table of contents in your book. In your book, by the way, is almost 800 pages. It's called Behave, the Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst. And just looking at the table of contents, it's really kind of fascinating how you do this. It's like zooming out. Have you ever seen that book, The Powers of 10, where you go from the cosmos down? Well, you start from the behavior in the brain, and then chapter 2 is 1 second before. Chapter 3 is seconds to minutes before. Chapter 4 is hours to day before. And you keep zooming out until centuries and millennia, and then evolution. That's a fascinating way to look at these different layers. How did that idea come to you?
Well, that's just sort of a way of organizing all those influences. Much of that has to do with one of the people who I dedicated the book to, Mel Connor, who's an anthropologist physician, who's currently at Emory, was at Harvard before that, who was my undergraduate advisor way back when, and sort of taught me to think that way, in this multidisciplinary way, and literally with this mindset that if you want to understand a behavior, you got to understand what went on, everything from in those neurons a second before, a millisecond before, to millions of years of evolutionary influences and everything in between.
The music is signaling that we're coming to the end of this segment. We are having a fascinating conversation with Robert Sapolsky about his new book, Behave, the Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst. I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor.
I'm Dan Barker, and we have some more questions about violence and aggression compared to empathy and altruism.
Tribalism and xenophobia, things like that. So don't miss the final segment.
Hello, this is Janine Garofalo. Are you tired of right-wing politicians who desperately want to impose their religious beliefs on the rest of us? I know I am. That's why I'm asking you to support the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Join the fight and call the Freedom from Religion Foundation toll-free at 1-800-335-4021. That's 1-800-335-4021. Or visit the Freedom from Religion Foundation website at ffrf.org. That's www.ffrf.org. Proud to be an atheist, Janine Garofalo.
It ain't necessarily so. This is Freethought Radio.
I'm Dan Barker.
I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor.
And we're continuing our talk with Robert M. Sapolsky. He's the author of many books, but his newest book just came out last month. It's called Behave, The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst.
So I thought, Robert, it would be nice to start with the last sentence of your book for the second segment of our interview. You write, finally, you don't have to choose between being scientific and being compassionate. So tell us more about that.
Well, and one of the uphill battles one has sort of as a practicing professional scientist is the sense that it's this Mr. Machine, sort of purely affectless kind of process. You know, for better or worse, scientists have like same emotions as everybody else, and it infiltrates into doing their science. But in the larger sense, there's a certain sort of hard-nosed view that often comes in saying that, well, there's a difference between the way the world is and the way it should be, and you shouldn't confuse the two. And often what you have to come to terms with is biology produces some pretty unsavory conclusions and some pretty pessimistic ones about human behavior, biology that suggests there are inevitabilities built around hierarchy and stratification, or inevitabilities about male violence and domination, or inevitabilities about certain other social structures. And turns out that that's not a case of, oh, come on, grow up, time to have to recognize that, like, it would be nice if it was all kumbaya, but the biology of who we are as a species presents a pretty grim, sort of Hobbesian picture. But the reality is that there's very little that's inevitable, and when you look closely, the biology, all of those biological influences from a second before to a million years before, means that what we are above all else is a species with enormous behavioral flexibility. In other words, a huge percentage of what could pass for inevitabilities in human behavior, and some of the more unsavory aspects are by no means inevitable.
So are we trying to transcend our biology here?
No, more like understanding which circumstances bring out the best biologically based behaviors in us rather than the worst biologically based.
Well, because compassion and altruism, they are also biological. They serve their purpose as well. We can't help being loving and caring. I think the basic human attitude is one of helping each other, and it seems to me that the headlines in the newspaper are reporting, by and large, aberrations to human behavior. We say, ooh, that's an unhuman thing they are doing.
Yep, and something I discuss sort of at various points in the book, sort of the definitive magisterial account of this is Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which documents, amid all the lousy, crummy, depressing things that characterize our world, nonetheless, this is a much, much nicer, more humane, more compassionate, more empathic world than it was 100 years ago.
Yeah, and Steven Pinker is the honorary president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, and I think his book is just coming out as a graphic nonfiction book, and he's going to be speaking at our upcoming convention in September in Madison. So he'd love to hear that tribute, and it is wonderful to be reminded of this.
So speaking of Pinker, in his book, which had a profound impact on me, I think it was in 2000, The Blank Slate. And I think I agree with you, Robert, that we are not a blank slate. We've been hearing for a long time that behaviorism is dead, and I think I agree with you that it pretty much is, but it keeps popping its head up. Is behaviorism dead? Are we just a bunch of programmable robots, or do we come prepackaged with instincts for violence and for compassion?
Much more the latter. I mean, a classic behaviorist framework, which is you could make pretty much any behavior more prevalent in an organism, including us, with the right rewards. You could make it less prevalent with the right absence of rewards or punishment. That turns out to work wonderfully in some realms, and that could explain a lot about what rats and pigeons do. Turns out it doesn't explain a lot of the most interesting things about us or other primates, if for no other reason work that was pioneered right in your neck of the woods in Madison, Harry Harlow's classic work looking at attachment in infants, infant primates. And what that winds up giving us insight into is one of the great counters to behaviorist predictions, which is when we wind up loving the wrong person and loving an abusive person and it's more complicated than a simple set of reward and punishment rules.
One of the fascinating chapters in your book that I really liked, in fact, I jumped ahead and read it first, was about adolescence and the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex, I think you call it, showing that that's the last part. Is the frontal lobe the most recently developed part of our brain?
Yeah, and it's so interesting. In the frontal cortex, we've got more of it, or more complex version of it than in any other species. As you said, it's the most recently evolved. And basically, if you want to summarize like a gazillion things that the frontal cortex does into a soundbite, it makes you do the harder thing when that's the right thing to do. Gratification, postponement, delay, long-term planning, impulse control, emotional regulation. And as you bring up the defining thing, the thing that explains what adolescence is all about in lots of ways, is it's the last part of the brain. The frontal cortex is the last part of the brain to fully mature. For an adolescent, you've got reward pathways that marinate you in dopamine and all the other emotional parts of the brain. They're going full blast by early adolescence. The frontal cortex isn't fully online until you're about 25 years old.
Well, that's a long time.
Well, and it explains risk-taking, as you point out, and it might explain why it's easy to draft young teenagers and it's harder to draft somebody who's over 25, to go to war, for example. It
explains why, violence disproportionately comes from teenagers and young adults. It explains why deciding to devote your life to the needy disproportionately comes from teenagers and young adults and everything in between. It explains why the emotional makeup of teenage adolescent behavior is a gyroscope where the highs are higher and the lows are lower. It's because that steadying hand of the frontal cortex isn't there fully yet.
When you're sitting in a public meeting and you feel like burping, for example, out loud, isn't that frontal lobe that sort of double check, oops, I shouldn't be burping out loud in this meeting?
Yep. And whether it's that or, ooh, don't be a serial murderer, all of those are versions of, it could be very difficult to do the right thing in certain contexts, and it takes a strong frontal cortex. Now, part of what makes that so fascinating, and that whole business we were talking about earlier of context dependency in humans, is it can take a lot of frontal function to resist the temptation to lie in a certain circumstance. Great, that makes perfect sense. There's your frontal cortex helping you wrestle with the devil of temptation, all of that. But at the same time, once you decide that you are going to lie, it takes a frontal cortex working very well to do it effectively, because you got to control your voice and your facial expressions and where your eye contact is happening. And So here's a part of the brain that both helps you to not lie in some circumstances, in others it helps you to lie effectively, and in others it helps you to learn the whole world of situational ethics of lying. It's okay to lie if you're up on stage pretending to be a depressed Danish prince in a Shakespeare play, even though that's not really what you're feeling. That's an okay lie. It's okay to lie to somebody if it's grandma and she's brought you a toy that you already have, and you're supposed to say, no, I don't have this, I love it, thank you so much. Whoa, this is the part of the brain that's teaching all that sort of context dependency. No wonder it doesn't mature until you're 25. It's got the hardest learning tasks of any part of the brain.
Well, maybe the fundamentalists should worry more about the frontal cortex and less about original sin. We are out of time, and we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today, Robert Sapolsky, to talk about your monumental book, Behave, the Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst. And thank you again.
Well, thank you for having me, and as always, my deep appreciation of you guys and the foundation, and keep up the good fight.
Thank you. That's Robert
Thank you.
Sapolsky. That's our show for today. We also want to thank Audrey Martinovich, our producer and engineer, recording in the Stephen Yule Friendly Atheist Studio. Hello to listeners on WOOL in Bellows Falls, Vermont, New Hampshire, in College Station, Bryan, Texas, on KEOS, on KOPN, Columbia, Missouri, in Watkins Glen in Ithaca, New York, on W201CD, Geneva Community Radio, on Janesville Community Radio in Wisconsin, that's WADR, here in Madison on WIDE, and also on WMUULP. And hello, of course, to all of our thousands of podcast listeners around the world. You can find out more about our show at ffrf.org/news/radio.
And on behalf to honor Independence Day, we invite you to join the Freedom from Religion Foundation in our work to keep government independent of religion. We have a sample of our newspaper available at ffrf.org, or you can join us and tune in next week for more rational radio and blasphemous broadcasting.